Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great day. My name is Glenn Deason, and today I am joined by my dear friend Pepe Escobar, who is a journalist and a geopolitical analyst. It's good to see you again.
Wonderful to see you, Glenn. Great pleasure. We haven't met in person in a while.
I know. Um, I really wanted to speak with you today. So I know you're traveling a lot, all over the place. So I'm glad I was able to catch you between your trips. Uh, but we both have a shared interest in Eurasian integration, and especially Brics as a key institution to facilitate this huge shift towards multipolar international economic architecture. And this is, of course, the partnership initially between Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but now, of course, with new member states and partner states. So given that you focus a lot on BRICS, how would you, I guess, briefly explain what it is and its purpose, but also why its development has really intensified and gained so much momentum over the past few years?
Yes, I would like to make a short introduction, Glenn, before we get to BRICS. This past, I would say, months and a half, I heard a lot of conflicting interpretations of what BRICS is doing and where they plan to go. And especially this year, because under the Brazilian presidency, the amount of work they're going to put compared to what the Russians did last year is minimal. As you know, the BRICS summit is going to be in early July in Rio. They had their first meeting a few days ago, late February. So they're going to have March, April, May, and June. Only four meetings with all of them on the table. The working groups and the BRICS Business Council. That's not enough to set up a proper annual BRICS summit like the Russians did last year in Kazan. I spent almost half of the year here in Russia last year following closely the preparations, the summits, and it was an amazing amount of work. So the Russians probably worked for 3 years knowing that the Brazilians will pick it up afterwards, and it would not be exactly very professional, to say the least. I have deep restrictions on the way the Brazilian foreign ministry regards BRICS. Some of my best sources confirm that there is an anti-BRICS lobby inside the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Relations and the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. And of course, let's say, the ruling elites in Brazil, the old money, let's say the 50, 70 old money families, plus the new money, they are not exactly pro-BRICS. They are pro-US, Atlanticists, easy profits. They don't have any strategic idea of what BRICS plan to do. So this year for BRICS is not going to be exactly an advance compared to last year and the summit in Kazan, which, as you know very well, was an enormous breakthrough when they called the 13 new partners, when everybody was sitting at the table, when we had the meeting in Kazan with Putin presiding over virtually everybody that matters in the global south was sitting on that round table. It was immensely impressive. So this year is going to be very complicated, and I wonder what they can achieve in half of the year before the summit in Rio in early July. And another thing that you probably know very, very well, for China, the most important element is not exactly BRICS, is the New Silk Roads, BRI, which they conceptualized in 2013, and which is basically their overarching geopolitical and geoeconomic framework of expanding Chinese trade all over the planet. And now, in terms of China-Russian relations, this is something that it's very hard to discuss here in Moscow. I heard from some Russian scholars that yes, we don't know as much as about China as we should. And the interactions on an intellectual level, they are relatively limited. and the Chinese on the other side, which is something I was discussing in Lebanon this past weekend with a Chinese scholar, exactly. It's a sort of dichotomy. They are not exactly happy, to put it diplomatically, with the war in Ukraine because that devalued the top destination of BRI, which is the European market. Europe, as we all know, is broke at the moment. They only find money that they don't have to buy unimaginable more weapons to Ukraine, as Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Csiharto just mentioned a few days ago. But in terms of the commercial trade alliance between China and Europe, that is very, very wobbly, to say the least. At the same time, the Chinese are learning all the lessons they are able to learn from the success of the SMO and from the fact that Russia faced face down and stared down the whole collective West, and Russia inflicted a strategic defeat on Europe and not vice versa. The Chinese are learning all they can about that. So it's mixed feelings, you see. So I wonder how all that will be translated into on the ground conversations and on the table conversation among the top Brics members in the next 4 months, which is absolutely nothing. Huh?
But one of the things which has gained, I guess, momentum, a big breakthrough, I guess, would be the most recent member, which is Indonesia. This is, for me, this is, yeah, not appreciated enough. For many, at least in Europe, Indonesia is just another country in Asia, but this is truly a giant. This is, 280 plus million people in a economy rising, strategically positioned in terms of international maritime corridors, rich in resources. How are you reading this sudden and, I guess, very huge change in Brics that is bringing, yeah, in Indonesia on the inside?
Oh, yes, Glenn, you touched on an absolutely key point. Well, I live in Southeast Asia part of my life. I moved to Asia 31 years ago. Uh, my bases were usually Bangkok and Hong Kong, but I worked on Indonesia a lot. Especially, I saw the Suharto coup in front of me, for instance, so I followed the whole post-Suharto Indonesia. I went there a lot, especially in the 90s and the 2000s. And it is the ASEAN powerhouse. Absolutely no question about that. And one of the great powers of the 21st century. Nobody, virtually nobody in the West, apart from scholars like you, Glenn, understand that. Absolutely correct. And obviously, Russia and China do understand that. Of course, both lobbied heavily for Indonesia to come straight to the table, not even as a partner, like, for instance, Malaysia and Vietnam, or the two Central Asians, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They lobbied for Indonesia to be immediately discussing the most important pressing issues regarding Brics. Absolutely correct decision. The problems that they might have in the South China Sea, China and Indonesia, were solved years ago. And Russia is investing heavily on their soft power in Indonesian relations, part of the Russian ASEAN offensive. Let's put it as a soft power offensive and also investment offensive. And it's not by accident that Putin last year, in all those fora, he was always saying that the two most important areas of development ahead of us are Africa and Southeast Asia. He was simply basically Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, which are now practically inside BRICS, right? So obviously in the West, nobody gets it. But Indonesia as a whole will offer, I would say, a Southeast Asian, East Asian balance inside BRICS that is essential in including relations with the Persian Gulf monarchies, which are now in BRICS as well. Saudi Arabia, as we all know, it's on the fence. It is and it isn't. And if you ask the Saudis, they all come up, of course, our relationship with America, blah, blah, blah. But long term, Saudi Arabia is in BRICS. The short term, not exactly. And obviously UAE, which is diversifying their investments everywhere. And Indonesia is one of them.
Yeah, well, I guess the you mentioned the Brazilian possible setback of BRICS. It
Yeah.
does well. One has to add though that BRICS is not centralized in the same extent which many people envision it, such as the European Union, for example. And this is part of also part of the attraction of BRICS that is not
Mhm.
that yeah, that it mainly facilitates these alternatives instead of forcing yeah, this centralization. And it also has these other branches, as you said. It attempts to harmonize different initiatives. So you have the China's Belt and Road Initiative, you know, that Russian Iranians and the Indians with this international North-South corridor. You have a
Right.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization doing its bit, and overall, it's a very decentralized network to organize all this new technological industrial cooperation, all these new transportation corridors coming along, and of course all the financial cooperation with banks and using national currencies, which is why I was a bit perplexed by Trump's comment that he argued, you know, he's going to put tariffs on anyone who that tries to avoid using the dollar, and for this reason he declared that BRICS was over. Did he? I guess did he announce the funeral a bit too soon, or?
Exactly. He said Brics is dead. Huh?
Yeah.
His own words. Well, Glenn, that shows that Trump and the people he appointed to be around him, they have absolutely no clue about BRICS. Well, but this is something that comes from years ago. When I was in Washington years ago and I mentioned BRICS, everybody was like, "What? Club? What is this?" You know, and this hasn't changed even after Kazan last October. You never see a serious discussion of BRICS on American think tanks. And I receive a lot of crap in my inbox all the time. They still have no idea what BRICS is about. And obviously, Trump always coming with a bombastic formulation that monopolizes the news cycle for 24 hours, 48 hours, etc. He's been coming back to BRICS is scared, BRICS is dead, etc., without thinking about the consequences of slapping 150% tariffs on all BRICS countries. This will be the blow black for the American economy will be beyond massive. And the fact that most BRICS in the Eurasia sphere, they don't care about America anymore. They don't need it. They're trading among themselves more and more, and trading among themselves using their currencies. The key for BRICS is not, once again, we have to repeat this over and over again. It's not a BRICS currency. It's implementing new alternative payment systems, which is what they do in what I call last year the BRICS lab. They're testing models all the time. Before I traveled this past 2 weeks, I had a meeting here with one of the guys of the BRICS Business Council. They're saying, look, we're testing everything. And when we have enough tests of each model, we will go back to the leader and say, look, we tested all that. Maybe we should implement one of these models for all of us. So BRICS it's a non-stop lab, in fact, and that's fantastic. And it's based on mutual trade with mutual currencies and poly trade with poly currencies, but that's it. And of course, bypassing the dollar in a very subtle manner, which is something that the Russians and the Chinese are already doing. 90% of their trade now is bypassing the dollar without announcing that they're doing that. So BRICS strategy has to, they are not confrontational, which is something very important. Lavrov keeps saying this all the time. There is a problem which I would like to ask your view on that, in fact, that BRICS should be more organized as as a multilateral organization with a secretariat and more binding rules. For the moment, it's like a loose club. Lavrov, the last time we talked about this with a small group of us, he said he prefers that it be this way. I think after Kazan, no, it has to be more, let's say, not regimented, but more organized, because what they have ahead of them is literally a war of Trump 2.0 against BRICS, with some of them in the direct line of fire, like South Africa and Brazil. for instance. Pressures over Turkey not to get closer to BRICS. There will be pressures over Indonesia, of course. Pressures over Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, no question about that. So BRICS has to be more solid as a multilateral organization. I would love to hear your view on that, in fact.
Well, I see the benefits of imposing a bit stricter structure, but but a key attraction by many of the member states, at least yeah, from my conversations, has been that it's the loose structure which makes it more appealing, that it's not imposed to the same extent, and also the fact that it has more a multilateral format, which is why we're not just going to use this one currency, this one payment system.
Mhm.
The fact that yeah, that there are alternatives, and I think this is also something that's quite necessary to a multipolar system, because if everything was, here's the new, for example, only Chinese payment system, and everyone has to use this one, I think many would feel a
Exactly.
bit trapped. And indeed, in some conversations I had with when I meet with the former Indian ambassador to Russia, he always makes this point as well, that India would oppose a common currency with BRICS simply because China is so large that BRICS would become very organized around China, too China-centric, and this undermines the whole principle of BRICS facilitating multipolarity. So. I think this is where the strength often come from having a bit looser structure. But of course, I'm not dismissing the point you're making, that as it's under attack as well, it creates some pressure for setting more set structures. But
Mhm.
this is also why I think that the U.S. Criticism or even attack on BRICS is a mistake, because even threatening to use sanctions on BRICS country to prevent them from trading in their own currencies, all this is doing is he neglects what BRICS is. This is what BRICS is. It's you have a lack of trust in the US centric economic system, because the US in relative decline. When it is in the relative decline, it will use its control over these key economic instruments, such as the currency, more coercively to punish other countries who do not follow the US diktat. So they will only become more aggressive as they're in relative decline. And so this is why this huge demand for BRICS, exactly because people don't trust the US system anymore, simply
Mhm.
because it is becoming a tool for great power politics. And this has always been common sense, is what I've also been writing about for the past decades, is when a hegemon is in decline, it's not going to have the same liberal, open economic system anymore, because then its principal objective will be to prevent the rise of rivals. And that's why yeah, from free access in its transportation corridors, access to its technologies and industries, access to its banks, its currencies, everything will become weaponized to prevent the rise of rivals, which is why you see now with the theft of Russian national reserves, or the efforts to destroy or inhibit China's technological rise. So as the trust in the US system diminishes, this is why people are fleeing to BRICS. So this is very, I think, a foolish approach by Trump to threaten BRICS, not to create alternatives, because this only proves the point that they need it. And I also think that we need it more now than ever, since the
Exactly.
hegemonic system is over, and it could actually be beneficial. I think we think too much in the West into bloc politics, them versus us. But keep in mind that BRICS, when it brings in opponents, be it Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, and Iran, these are, the whole point is to try to harmonize some of the differences, to use economic connectivity to resolve political differences. So
Yeah.
in my opinion, the main goal for the US and, well, Russia should be to ensure that BRICS is not anti-American and America is not anti-BRICS, because it should be possible to, you know, to reduce dependence on the US, in other words, for BRICS to be anti-hegemonic without being anti-American. And yeah, so there should be a possibility to harmonize interests. So the US can be, one among several great powers. It doesn't have to be defeated, but when it puts itself as a direct opponent of BRICS, trying to destroy this, then you will create more of a zero-sum format. And I think this is, yeah, I think this is a huge mistake. Indeed, when I met Putin in November, I even asked him this question
I remember.
very, very clearly, like, is it possible for BRICS and this cooperation to be, of course, anti-hegemonic. This will be a positive thing as unipolarity comes to an end, but without being anti-American. And how would you, differentiate between the two? But I think this is a key challenge, and this is what we should be discussing because the Americans do recognize unipolarity is over. So why attempt to sabotage some of the key institutions, which is laying the foundation for a multipolar system? And I think what the Americans risk is this multipolar system emerging under the auspices of Brics. It could become anti-American because they're under attack by the United States. That's seen as and this is very unnecessary. I think the main objective of Brics and multipolarity should be to pursue less zero-sum approach to economics and security, and instead find some, as the Chinese always point out, win-win solutions. But I think we're a bit trapped in this bloc politics in the West, and as you mentioned, I think that's also why we don't want to report on Brics in the Western media because we're stuck in narratives. We
Yeah.
always have to be presented as being strong, united, even when, NATO is fragmenting. Our opponents, the Russian Chinese, always have to be presented as distrusting each other and, everything is a marriage of convenience. So we're living in this alternative universe. And as a result, when you have these huge developments in Brics, what do our media do? There's no good narrative. So we just say, well, it's not relevant. Let's not legitimize it. Let's not create a momentum. So let's just not mention it. We pretend it doesn't exist. And this is seen as this controlling the narrative is a way of, constructing a new reality. But I think the alternative is now what's actually happening is we're just ignoring when we're not seeing the world in front of us and we're living in a ridiculous bubble. And that bubble, I think, just burst. But
But forget about Western media, Glenn.
yeah.
Look, I've been playing this rodeo for 40 years. All of us old school foreign correspondents, and I'm one of the last one alive. We know how Western mainstream media work, and now we don't care about it anymore because they are irrelevant. Social media is where the debate is. And in social media, at least we have some, glimpses of even across the global north of analysts starting to understand what Brics is all about. But most important point, the only person who can actually explain to Trump what Brics is all about is Putin on a one-on-one. Xi Jinping wouldn't be able to do that. Putin can, especially because the driving force of Brics, not all, I would say that over the past year and even before the past year with the Kazan summit is Russia. And ahead will still continue to be Russia, especially because Russia now has the clout of having inflicted a real strategic defeat over the whole collective West. So the president of the United States has to listen to the president of the Russian Federation. This is one of the main, if not the main reason. If Putin is going to convince Trump that Brics is not anti-American, which is not by definition, Brics wants to find uh, a different form and framework of international relations, geopolitical and geoeconomic. This is not necessarily anti-American. America can be at the table as well, of course. But try to explain this not only to Trump, but to the US deep state. In this case, it's absolutely out of the question. But Trump might understand that and tweak his policies towards, I would say, a certain accommodation vis-a-vis Brics. For the moment, it's very complicated, Glenn, because he's involved in so many battles, in so many fronts simultaneously. And for him, foreign policy is not the main battleground. It's domestic. He needs to clear his domestic swamp first. Otherwise, they will eat him alive within the next 2 years. And he knows that because he learned from Trump 1.0. So now he's concentrating his efforts internally. Externally, it's these reality show outbursts. And sometimes you don't even know what he's saying or if he remember what he said before in terms of the possible negotiations with Russia, in terms of the offers that he's allegedly making Russia, in terms of the offers Putin made him also allegedly. So it's like a Netflix series without a plot line, with lots of cliffhangers that go nowhere, in fact. So we have to be very clear on what they will discuss when they meet in person. And this is one of the key points. How Putin is going to explain to Trump the repercussions of what happened and still happening in Ukraine, what these top emerging nations all across the global majority are trying to do in terms of finding a new system of international relations that does not exclude the US, but also brings the US into it. And this is something that will be, to quote Xi Jinping, a win-win for all parties, including the Americans, which is something that try to explain this in Washington. Nobody will get it now. But if Putin explains this to Trump, maybe in a few months they'll start having a serious discussion. When you read think tank papers on uh, Trump foreign policy, or it's always it's still a Cold War mindset. These people are very, very dumb, and they're still living in the past. It's like an agglomeration of General Kellogg's, thinking together. It's a joke. But so it's up to, I would say, the intellectual firepower of Brics as well, probably via social media, probably via the analysis that you do, among others, to explain to Western opinion makers what is it about Brics.
Yeah, no. Well, I think the whole narrative war has been yes, been very detrimental, and it also, yeah, essentially creating alternative realities. I think this has been a key problem. It's something that can also obstruct, of course, the negotiations now between the US and Russia, but also the US approach to BRICS. There was an interesting article came out a few days ago by George Beebe's, yeah, the former CI director of Russia analysis, and where she pointed out that the narrative war, the narrative control has been a huge part of this proxy war against Russia. And he argues now reality is winning forward because there is an objective reality. And I think that this is a very important point to also get across, because you realize what a strange reality bubble, especially here in Europe, has been created. For example,
Mhm.
now that the United States talks to Russia, there is a reason behind this. That is, we lost the proxy war. And
Exactly.
we don't have more weapons to send. Our economies are broke, as you said, a strategic defeat, and NATO might not survive. And the Ukrainian army is facing a pending collapse. However, in Europe, everything has to be this simplistic binary of good versus evil, this Cold War mentality. So when they see Trump talking to the Russians, how can they possibly explain this? Do they discuss what's actually happening on the ground? What is the alternatives to making a deal with Russia when we're losing? No, they're saying, oh, well, either you're pro-Ukraine or you're pro-Russia.
That's it,
And if
exactly.
you're pro-Ukraine, you'll keep on fighting no matter what, even if the war has been lost. And given that he wants to talk to Russia, well, now he's pro-Russian. And this is why it's impossible to have any sensible discourse on this continent. There's no one who's able to discuss the motivations why Russia invaded to begin with. The only thing is, he's the new Hitler or wants to restore Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Always our own actions is taken out of the equation. That's a condition. Otherwise, we might
That's a condition. Yes.
suggest that it's been provoked. Same as the election of Trump. No one could imagine that Trump could be elected again because no one ever argued why Americans rejected Kamala and why they embraced him. It's same as the sanctions. It's so frustrating that, yeah, for 3 years I explained why sanctions wouldn't work, why they would backfire, and why Russia had made itself immune, because this is one of my main research areas, and it didn't matter. All this said, well, that sounds like pro-Russian arguments or pro-Russian narratives, because if you're pro-European or pro-Ukrainian, then you support the sanctions, and you repeat these narratives. So we created this really absurd fake reality, and
Absolutely.
it's yeah, Europe is destroying itself, and we're helping to destroy Ukraine as well, and anyone who disagrees with this is pro-Russian and anti-Western. It's just beyond. And this is why I'm a bit also worried that who's actually feeding information to Trump here. And how do you see this? Do you think it's all for show, or this making friends with Russia, or does he see what's happening on the ground? Because he seems to often be saying the right things, but I just saw that now the Ukrainians agreed to hand over a lot of the resources to the Americans, and suddenly,
They had no alternative.
and he's talking about how great weapons, how they sent javelins, which, escalated the conflict and contributed to the war to begin with. So do you see him? is he just a very transactional opportunist, or do you think he has a wider strategic picture here of how the world is shifting? Because this will impact his approach to BRICS as well, I think.
Absolutely. Glenn, with Trump, we have to follow the money, always. So he came to the conclusion, even before he was elected, that this war is a very bad business deal, especially for the US. So what does he do? He transfers the cost of the post-war, assuming that the war will keep going on, because this is exactly what the European Union, the European Commission want. Those mutts actually believe that they can win a war against a superpower like Russia. Okay, let them think about that and let them commit harakiri in progression. No problem. It's their problem. Now they have an extra problem because they have to pay up. So what does Trump do? Okay, you want to continue the war? No problem. It's your problem. You have to put up with the 5% of GDP, all of you. We are not going to contribute more than we did. We want our money back, which is, as you just mentioned, this deal of basically extraction and exploitation of Ukrainian natural resources. This is typical Trump. That's it. So at least we're going to get our money back, or even more than our money. We're going to recoup our non-investment, in fact. So he already transferred the burden of everything that happens with rump Ukraine from now on to the European Union. How are they going to continue with their war strategy? Nobody knows, because they don't have that kind of money, period, to start with. They don't have weapons, period. This means they'll have to buy extra, unimaginable, to quote again the Hungarians, amounts of weapons from the Americans. So the Americans are going to win twice on all that. And the most extraordinary thing is that those idiots in Brussels, they actually don't see it. Now, with the BlackRock new chancellor of Germany, we have an inkling that some of them are starting to get the picture. But still, that's not enough. This means that they will have to reassess their strategy vis-a-vis Ukraine, because they can't. Because as you just mentioned, that's an ironclad narrative. They simply cannot back down. Otherwise, they will not only they will lose face, but they will be hunted in the streets by the 450 million European citizens, for that matter. So they are now in, I would say, in the last stage of a desperation role. They'll have to pay up for their policy, for their failed policy, if they want to continue. The Americans don't care about them, because Trump has already made it very clear that they are not sitting at the table. They are part of the menu. This is the headline of the whole story. Because, as you know very well, we both live in Europe. You more than I do, but we both live in Europe part of our time. And we see how these European elites are so arrogant and ignorant at the same time, and with a superiority complex that is absolutely impossible to slash off. So they won't change their attitude, whatever happens. So now they have to find the money that they don't have to pay for the continuation of their strategic defeat long term. They cannot count on the Americans for that. They cannot count on the global South, the global majority, even parts of the global North. They will be even more antagonized by the global South and the global majority. And that's it. So there are only two losers in the whole Ukraine project. Ukraine itself, which is now condemned to be a rump Ukraine, totally decimated economically, politically, in human terms, population terms, you name it, and the European Union, NATO, which will lead eventually to the breakup, I would say simultaneous breakup of both the EU and NATO, probably in parallel and probably at the same time, and sooner rather than we think.
Yeah, no, this is this is again what I meant, the absurdity of the discourse and what happens when you live in a bubble. Because now the EU,
Yes.
of course, will spend money it doesn't have to buy weapons that don't exist in order to continue a war, which the Russians, Americans, the Chinese, and the majority of Ukrainians, by the way, actually wants to end. And
Mhm.
they're all and all of this is supposed to make sense, and they're all patting each other on the back that they are on the right side of history. And it's no, it's quite extraordinary. And I think a good case of this. I guess I'm not sure if you've been following the G7 discussion because Trump is
Oh,
suggesting perhaps Russia should be brought back in to make it the G8, and the Europeans, they're not interested, and
and the
certainly they
Russians said,
would
"No,
put
we're not interested."
yeah, they won't put strict conditions. But on this, actually, the Europeans might be on the same page as the Russians because the Russians are, the assumption is that the Russians want to come back, that they, craving to get a seat at the table in Europe, which is, well, let's be honest, on fire at the moment. And so, but the Russians are with Brics. They're preparing a future
Yeah,
in the East and in the non-Western world, not to be necessarily anti-Western, but simply to make the West matter less. And this is, I guess, the key goal of BRICS, not anti-West, but less Western-centric.
exactly.
This whole thing, if we're going to next discussion in Europe, is going to be whether or not to allow Russia to join the G7, which it's not really
Who
interested in. It
cares?
just shows a disconnect, doesn't it? Or
Who cares? Exactly. The future is across Eurasia, or what we could call Afro-Eurasia, and this expanded BRICS, intercontinental expanded BRICS. That's it. With all that enormous list who wants to become partners as well. The list continues. It's still 30 something, over 40 probably by now. And it's, I would say, this beyond impossible to explain to the ruling Atlanticist transatlantic elites that there's a new paradigm in town. They will never admit it because if they admit it, they have to admit first that the past roughly 250 years of uncontrolled Western domination of the planet is over. And second, that they suffered a major strategic defeat by Russia in Novorossiya when they thought that they would destroy Russia and then plunder all the Russian resources. They deeply believed in that exactly 3 years ago. We all remember that, right? So can you imagine admitting all that at the same time, Glenn? It's humanly impossible for people who are used to say it's our way or the highway. And now they are in the middle of the highway as roadkill. Just like that, history, these twists and turns of history are always fascinating, right? But this is the position they are in. The Americans is different. It's still an empire. We have all to live with it. There are ways to contain the empire and try to, let's say, have a dialogue with the empire, as Lavrov and Ryabkov are always saying, considering history, geography, culture, other nations' strategic interests. Of course, it's possible to have a dialogue. This will have to start from scratch. What we're witnessing now is a US-Russia relationship restarting from literally scratch. Only what, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Ryabkov was saying, and you remember this very well, that US-Russian relations were on the verge of an abyss, practically. So they have to start climbing out of the abyss and, okay, let's start, having diplomatic missions on both sides, working groups, and then we're going to start talking about specific problems, including the war in Ukraine. So this is where we start now. It's the beginning of a very, very long process. And Europe is self-excluded from this process. So now we have two superpowers talking to each other. And there's another one, China, looking on the sidelines, but learning from this whole process. Coming back to the beginning of our conversation, the Chinese are, we can say that they are fascinated of what they are about to learn about these twists and turns because they are next, and they know that they are next. Trump says that the major strategic threat and the big battle is against China, and the people around him as well. They're all xenophobes, essentially. So this is where we are at the moment, the beginning of a long road. And the most fascinating aspect is that Europe is nowhere to be seen.
no, it's a kind of amazing that this is only 3 weeks ago when it looked like the US and
Exactly.
Russia would be
Exactly.
heading towards major conflict and clash. And now, of course, you have the Americans voting on the side of Russia in the UN. So it is
In
quite,
Iran.
but this is often what Trump is criticized for, that his administration is that are doing these huge shifts. But this is also some pragmatism when you realize that the hegemonic model in Europe has collapsed. At some point, you have to do course correction. I think this is the problem which you put your finger on in Europe, that they become so ideological and so trapped in their own narratives that they see that this is coming to an end, and yet they're not able to change course. Instead,
Mhm.
they're complaining about being excluded at at the most important negotiations coming now, but yet they're not willing to talk to the counterparts, and they put they show that they have unrealistic expectation, they show that they're unreliable, and yet they complain that they're excluded. It there's something very strange about yeah, how they're making themselves irrelevant. And there's also what you suggested, that they used to be the subjects of the global system for so long, the one that moving all the pieces around. They don't realize that they've been demoted to objects, that they're not sitting at the table with America, they're being moved as pieces around. And it's I remember I wrote a book back in 2021, well, published and at least, which was called, Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia, where I
Oh,
made
yes,
the
I read
point.
this book and I loved it. And you,
Well,
at the time, you
well,
were
yeah,
the only one conceptualizing it this way, Glenn. Nobody else was doing it. I remember very well.
but I was, but this is again 4 years ago. But I was pointing out where we're heading now, and this is in a
Yeah.
multipolar system. The Americans will demand more from Europe. That is, do your 5%, give us, transfer industries over to America, buy our expensive energy, our expensive weapons, and be more obedient. And at this, cut yourself off from the Russian, Chinese, and at the same time, America itself, being less relevant, would take its limited resources and pivot to Asia. So for Europe to be relevant, it had to begin to diversify. It had to adjust a bit, not to cut relation with America, of course not, but to also accept that with this huge Eurasian integration taking place, they have to find their position in a multipolar system instead of isolating themselves in these efforts to restore the unipolar order. And again, uh, they just have done everything wrong, and they're becoming more and
Mhm.
more irrelevant. And as a European, it really pains me to see
Of
the
course.
the foolishness. And again, this was a continent of where Henry Kissinger was born. This is where diplomacy and geopolitics almost was invented. And here we are. It's
Yeah.
quite extraordinary. So, anyways, we're almost out of time. So, do you have
Let
any
me
final
let
thoughts?
no, let me ask you a question. I've been dying to ask you this question, Glenn. How do you read the Baltic Chihuahua's dream of turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake?
Well, it's at the front of it, it looks a bit like comedy. This is
Mhm.
the three small Baltic states. They never attempted to find some reconciliation with Russia, and that was part of the post-Cold War problem. By only putting them into a military bloc, they were instead incentivized to pursue what they consider to be historical justice, or revenge on Russia. So they've been able to get away with a lot of this, and they become this one-tune banjo where the only foreign policy they have is to go harder against Russia. And my main concern over the past 3 years is we learned all the wrong lessons. Instead of provoking Russia, we told ourselves that, oh no, the Baltic states got it right all along. Putin is Hitler, and Russia is evil. So we essentially handed over the car keys to the Baltic states and say, run our foreign policies. Now the EU foreign policy chief, like Kaja Kallas, sitting there saying, "Oh, we don't believe in diplomacy, not with Russia. We don't talk to war criminals." So our chief diplomat don't want to do diplomacy. Instead, she's speaking openly about breaking up Russia and smaller countries. I mean,
Mhm.
we gave the car keys to maniacs, to be honest. I think this
Romania,
is
exactly.
and the EU will make itself irrelevant, because in the years to come now, not just years, months, weeks, the relevance and future of the EU will depend on its ability to adjust to these new realities. And we put, madmen effectively, or a mad woman in this sense, at the helm of the EU. So I think it's very disastrous. But I think the problem is a bit more is wider. That is, by expanding NATO, taking in Finland and Sweden. I think this is a historical threat to Russia, which has been, since the Kievan Rus dissolved and it
Mhm.
lost its connection with reliable waterways. A large part of Russian history has been the attempt to get access to reliable maritime corridors. And
I'm
for the
further.
states who wanted to balance it, be it the British or Americans, always the strategy has been to prevent this from happening. So what I see now is quite worrying because by militarizing Scandinavia to the extent they have been doing now, again, I don't know where Trump's going to go,
Mm,
but will confront the Russians in the Arctic. They will try to put a blockade. Well, they're openly talking about putting a blockade on the Russians in the Baltic Sea. You're having NATO officers saying, well, now that we have Finland and Sweden, we can essentially make the Baltic Sea a NATO lake. This is something that also the Baltic states and Poland keep repeating. This will put
mm,
great pressures on Kaliningrad. Former NATO Secretary General said that in the future we could put a blockade on St. Petersburg, and all this, you know, and they think this is security. If now we have this huge gun, we can put it all the way to the head of Russia. Now we have security. Now we can. What do we expect Russia to do? Will they
exactly.
capitulate? I mean, this is what the war in Ukraine was to a large extent about as well. That is to expel the Russians from the Black Sea. And these are the main
Exactly.
three seas the Russians have on their west. It's the Arctic, it's the Baltic, and it's the Black Sea. Ukraine, we did not weren't able to expel the Russians. Indeed, now as a result, the Russians have a much greater presence on the Black Sea. And but in the north, the two northern seas, the Arctic and the Baltic Sea, I'm quite worried about this
Mhm,
because the Europeans
mm.
still, when they talk about security, they don't talk about balancing the turns with reassurance. No, they're talking about how to have as much firepower as possible, as
Exactly.
big threats
Which
as
they don't
possible to
have. Yeah.
Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is a disaster, I think, and especially at this point in time when the unipolar system is breaking apart, and we now have to reconceptualize security as actually taking into account the security concerns of our opponents. This is when we're going to put this gun to Russia's head. I mean, it's wild. At the same time, America is pulling it doesn't want to be that involved in Europe. So what the hell are we doing? It's really absurd to watch. And I'm trying to get some, what is the common sense behind this? But when I listen to our politicians here in Scandinavia,
Yeah.
it's just dribble. It's just nonsense, emotional sloganeering, and anyone who disagrees with them is an evil Putin puppet. I mean, it's
Exactly.
very dangerous what we're doing now.
But it goes back to, I would say, the center of our conversation, Glenn. When you have a mad woman put in charge of the EU's foreign policy, representing 400 million European citizens, voters, taxpayers. This tells you everything you need to know about how the European Commission, which is that Kafkaesque organization in Brussels, you just need one day, walking in the corridors of the European Commission to know how it works. It's beyond Kafka. So that tells you everything you need to know how Europe is ruled. Europe is not ruled, as we all know, by Paris or Milano or Rome or Madrid. No, or even Warsaw is ruled by Brussels. And when you have the composition of the European Commission, the case of Callas, uh, the ones who preceded her, which were even more stupid, plus the revolving door at NATO, where you have from a Norwegian to a Dutchman, it gets even worse and even more disconnected from reality. That's all you need to know about. I would say, like the pit and the pendulum of Edgar Allan Poe. They're both plunging into the pit. EU and NATO as institutions, European institutions. This is not what the average citizen in Normandy in France or in Piemonte in Italy think about how Europe should work, be ruled to the benefit of European citizens. Not at all. It is a Kafkaesque Orwellian mechanism with their own agenda. And it's impossible to instill reason into the workings of this agenda, as you mentioned very, very well, different occasions. So that's it. This explains why this disconnect, this how a dysfunctional machine is capable of surviving. Its mechanism is its own survival. That's that. And based on this warmongering horizon to the heavens, literally, or to hell, more appropriately, right? If we don't change this, and European citizens, they are powerless to change Brussels. What happens? We're going to have pitchforks going to Brussels and decapitate all these people. It's not going to happen.
Well, this is how I see the EU is making itself irrelevant. Not just
Irrelevant.
put the Russian thing aside and the Americans, but just look at China. If Germany wants to remain have a competitive economy and remain relevant, it has to find some economic deals, especially for modernization with the Chinese. Well, at least diversify, not cut yourself off America,
Mm.
but when the Germans go to China to try to improve relations and have some economic ties, they're followed by the von der Leyens and the Callas and the rest of the EU bureaucracy who's doing the opposite. They want to be the geopolitical EU. They want to stare down the Chinese and throw some threats around. So
Mm.
they're undermining the interest of member states. And this is why it's so dangerous. At some point, the Germans, if they want to be relevant, they have to recognize that the EU is not doing us any benefits. The main purpose of the EU was to create collective bargaining power. And so
Yes.
we can come from a position of strength to deal with the Chinese as equals. Instead, we have the EU trying to, yeah, be some imagining some 19th century great power rivalry with the Chinese, staring them down, making them accept our superiority and a new unipolarity. It's just, yeah, it's beyond absurd. But anyways, Pepe Escobar, thank you so much for your time. I
Enormous
think I went a
pleasure.
bit over
I
here,
could go
so
on for another few hours. Thank you.
it's
My
been good to see you
pleasure.
again. I hope
Good
to
to
see you
see
soon.
you. Cheers. Hope to see you soon. Cheers. Bye bye. Thanks.
Bye.